Hi, welcome back to the Real News Network. We're continuing our discussion with investigative journalist and author Gareth Porter. If you haven't watched part one, you really should, because we're just picking up where we left off. So Gareth, let's take a look at this bigger picture here. You have this Saudi-Turkish strategic alliance, as they're calling it now. It really seems intent now, not just to continue the fight and that goes on forever. They seem to be trying to throw a lot more resources at really bringing down the Assad regime. In the view of the Saudis, and what their end game is what? I mean, I understand the Turks here in the sense that the Turks want to have a state that will be an ally in suppressing any Kurdish independence movement. And if they can determine the outcome of what happens in Syria, then they'll be able to use that administration against that type of Kurdish opposition and such. The Saudis, I guess this is what? This is a step towards having another regime under their suzerainty, under their control. I mean, what they can accuse Iran of, it's really more a Saudi plan. What Netanyahu accuses Iran of gobbling up one place after another. I mean, Saudi Arabia wants to gobble up even more Yemen. Now they're going to try to gobble up Syria. But to what end? What exactly do the Saudis get out of having Syria? I understand the Israeli interest here. They want to get rid of, damage Hezbollah as much as they can. What do the Saudis want out of Syria?
Well, what the Saudis are motivated by is this absolute fear of the Shia force power in the region, represented primarily by Iran, and then sort of imagining, for example, in Yemen, that the Iranians are behind everything that the Houthis do in Yemen, which is, of course, a total absurdity, has absolutely nothing to do with reality. But the Saudis, ever since the Arab Spring in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, have been really quaking in their boots because they are so afraid that the passing of traditional monarchies and authoritarian regimes in the region in favor of something else is going to affect the Saud family domination of Saudi Arabia in the future. And so therefore, ever since the Arab Spring, they have sort of leapt into a new sense of fear about Iran, which didn't exist before. And they are so paranoid now that you can no longer really analyze Saudi policy in the region as a kind of rational response to events. And so I think we have to kind of base the analysis on this irrational fear of Iran and their influence and the general sense of instability in the region that the Saudis feel threatens the regime itself.
Now, when the Arab Spring took place and there were uprisings in all the various countries, Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, came out very much in support of them. And now, of course, he didn't support what some people say at least began in the very early stages as something similar in Syria. But he came out and supported all these fights against the monarchies. He supported the overthrow of Mubarak. How much is Hezbollah considered a threat to places like the Saudis? And do they see it? One, it's allied with Iran, but also does it represent as a political force something that they would also see, along with the Israelis, they would like to see destroyed?
Well, obviously, the Saudis would agree with the Israelis on the idea that Hezbollah represents Iran's power, and that in that sense, Iran controls four Middle Eastern capitals, including Beirut and Sana'a, and of course Syria. Damascus is included in that as well. So I think that there is an automatic equivalence of any force that is aligned with Iran in any sense, and Iranian power, and that combines with this broader sort of scenario that the Saudis see of a whole set of political forces in the region that are aimed at overthrowing traditional authoritarian regimes. And so it's a combination of those things. It's not just one or the other.
Right. Now, we talked a little bit in part one about the Israeli interest. It seems to me the Israeli, and we've even seen some Israeli spokespeople overtly say this, whichever side is losing, help them and keep this war going forever. Especially, it seems to be, the more Hezbollah gets involved, the more Israel would like to keep this going forever and see if it can't bleed Hezbollah.
No question about it. I mean, that would be the Israeli strategy. It's in line with traditional strategic thinking of the Israelis more generally in the Middle East, particularly Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. These are places where they want to have the maximum amount of Sunnis killing Shiites, Sunnis killing Sunnis, and so forth. So definitely they would prefer that scenario as their best bet strategically. But increasingly, I mean, they're prepared to align themselves with all the forces that are calling for and working for the overthrow of the Assad regime, and that appears to be acceptable as a strategic result to the Israelis. So I think that there has been a shift away from simply wanting the maximum amount of instability to aligning themselves with the three Sunni states in calling for and really supporting whatever is necessary to bring down the Assad regime.
Because that would end support of all to Hezbollah in terms of Syrian support, but also Iranian arms getting to Hezbollah would make it far more difficult.
I think this is a key point that is not being discussed at all in the discourse on the Syrian crisis or on the whole Middle East situation. That is that the Israelis are aiming at the overthrow of Assad from their point of view, primarily in order to strip the Iranian regime of its frontline defenses, which include both Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The reason being that both Hezbollah and the Assad regime are part of the Iranian deterrent against Israeli attack.
The idea being if Israel ever did attack Iran, Hezbollah has a large supply of rockets now that are smart rockets and apparently could do real damage to Israel.
Absolutely. That is an essential part, has been for many years now, of the Iranian deterrent. The Iranians have never really had an adequate retaliatory capability. I mean, they do have some, but it's been derided by the Israelis. In fact, I mean, the Israelis may have something, there may be some truth to what they're saying, that the Iranians can do some damage, but not enough damage to necessarily deter Israel if there is no threat from Hezbollah in Lebanon and from, I mean, basically the Syrians are no longer capable of seriously threatening Israel because of the situation there under the present circumstances.
So what does the U.S. want out of all this? Their Iraq policy seems also betwixt and between. We know the Baghdad government is actually probably closer to the Iranians than they are to the Americans. I don't think there's much question about that. On the other hand, they still have an important relationship and dependence on the United States. I mean, do you think what's happening here is the U.S. is going to focus more on Iraq and trying to get the Iraqi army to defeat ISIS and let the Saudi and Turks do what they're going to do in Syria?
That does appear to be the present, not just the trend, but the fundamental picture of U.S. policy is precisely as you've put it, that the United States is saying, in effect, to the Sunni alliance, you go ahead and do whatever you feel needs to be done. We're not going to interfere. We're going to do the best we can to try to stave off the Islamic State in Iraq. But clearly, the evidence is very strong now that the U.S. commitment to the fight against Islamic State in Iraq is limited to use of air power. They're not going to commit to participate in ground combat against the Islamic State. That appears to be becoming more clear over time, that the U.S. military is against it, the Obama White House is against it. There is a very strong limit on the degree to which the United States is going to become involved in the fight against Islamic State in Iraq.
But do you think the bigger game plan of the Saudis is that if they're successful in Syria, do they then take this alliance that they create to overthrow Assad and actually move in towards Iraq and in some ways, start to actually assimilate, take over parts of Islamic State and try to regain Sunni control of Iraq?
I think, there's nothing, as far as I know, that is a matter of public record as far as Saudi calculus is concerned about Iraq and the relationship to their policy in Syria. But the logic of the situation is that they regard the Islamic State territory that it now holds in Iraq as an important counterbalance to Iranian influence in Iraq, and that they support that. There's every reason to believe that they would like to see the Islamic State hold out, that they're really not in favor of the United States defeating the Islamic State, not that that is anywhere on the horizon at this point, that's part of the broader Saudi strategy with regard to the region.
And if I go back to a point you made near the end of part one, if I own one of the major arms manufacturers and I'm in this business, it seems to me my dream scenario is at least close to a Saudi-Iranian confrontation in Iraq. I mean, where would you sell more weapons than that? It's a bonanza.
Well, this becomes a question of what is a realistic aim for the national security state and for its private sector allies at this point. My feeling is that there is a sense that both in terms of the international situation and in terms of the domestic U.S. political situation, they've sort of maxed out at the present level of military spending, and now the aim is not to see it go down substantially, to sort of maintain the status quo, which is, to avoid a very strong reduction, a big reduction in the defense budget. But I don't think that there is any aim at this point to see the United States engaged in a much larger military conflict.
Oh, I agree with that. I think what is shaping up here is a Saudi-Iranian, beginning with proxy wars, which is what's happening now, both, not so much as claimed in Yemen, but to some extent, certainly in Syria, and then more so than even now in Iraq. And if you start getting, if you ever had a situation where ISIS really was threatening Baghdad, are the Iranians just going to sit there? And the more U.S. policy allows this kind of vacuum, this kind of situation, the more the arms companies are going to be salivating.
Yeah, and I think that they're salivating not so much because of, I think perhaps you're suggesting this as well, they're not salivating because it's an opportunity to have the United States become involved in a war. But
no, not at all, not at all.
To continue to sell arms to the Saudis, to the Kuwaitis, to...
well, the Saudis are vying with India for being the #1 arms importer in the world. Right. I believe the number, I think last year it was some crazy number, like $80 billion. Am I getting that right? Do you know the number?
Well, the number that I have been using, which is based on the estimate that was offered back in 2010, 2011, when the initial deal between this Saudi Arabia and the the Pentagon was announced, was that there was anticipation that over 2 decades, the totality of the actual arms sold plus the follow-up service contracts would be in the neighborhood of $150 to $200 billion over a decade and a half to 2 decades.
And I saw a number that was more like, it doesn't contradict the number you're giving, But within the time frame of the last year or two, the Saudi expenditure alone was in the realm of something like $80 billion, and who knows what it is now.
That is correct. That is their defense budget.
And most of it's American purchases, but not all. And that's an interesting piece of leverage the Saudis have with the U.S. You know, they play footsie with the French, they play footsie with the Russians. Of course, the majority of the arms purchases, and this has always been part of the Saudi-American deal. The Americans will make sure the Saudis' monarchy remains in power, and they'll spend lots of oil money buying American weapons, which up until recently they didn't do a heck of a lot with, but now they are. But the possibility of a Saudi-Iranian conflict, this is going to fuel. I say possibility because they don't need the actual war; they just need the threat of war.
Right.
To start selling massive amounts of arms, even more.
I think what the national security state and the arms manufacturers really would like to see is a continuation of this situation, which is precisely the Saudis and the other Gulf states continuing to buy all these anti-missile systems, and as well as fighter planes and so forth, to maintain their budgets or increase their budgets and be prepared for war. But look, the real threat of war is not between the Saudis and Iran, it's between the Israelis and Iran. That's the big one that we all have to be afraid of. That is what I think is the greatest danger of this Obama policy, that he is allowing the situation to continue to deteriorate and to move toward the greatest danger that the Middle East and world politics faces, which is that the Assad regime will fall, that the Iranians will be bereft of an adequate deterrent, and that the Israelis will be tempted then to do
adequate deterrent back to meaning Hezbollah.
Pardon?
Losing Hezbollah's ability.
Losing Hezbollah's ability to serve as part of the deterrent, and therefore encouraging the Israelis to strike Iran and starting the big Middle East war.
Well, but Obama, and I don't often defend him, but he, in terms of negotiating this Iranian deal, and there's widespread public opinion in support of it. Europe's in support of it. Much of the Israeli intelligence military apparatus really is supporting the deal with Iran. It seems to me he's actually trying to mitigate that. And I understand what you're saying in terms of Assad and Hezbollah. But if they make the deal, that takes away, most of the legs from Netanyahu wanting to actually launch a war against Iran.
It does under the present circumstances. But what I'm suggesting is that if, in fact, there is this fundamental shift in power with the Assad regime gone and the inability of Hezbollah to maintain its ability to retaliate against Iran, because they will lose their ability to get reinforcements from Iran, that then you face a totally different situation with regard to the instability of this strategic situation between Israel and Iran.
Well, one way or the other, ka-ching, ka-ching, if you happen to own stock in military manufacturers. Thanks very much for joining us, Gary.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.